Hi, for those of you who are just logging on now, welcome to our presentation. We're going to wait a few more minutes, so just make yourself comfortable at home or wherever you're watching from, and we will look forward to starting soon. We're going to wait a little bit longer. There's definitely more people who are continuing to log on, so I hope everyone's doing well. Hi, for those who are just logging on right now, welcome. We're going to wait a couple more minutes. So I see that people are joining us. It's about 4:28, so we'll give it a few more minutes. And just as I said before, make yourself comfortable, get something to drink and relax. I think you will definitely enjoy this presentation. Amy, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing okay. This is my first presentation, so I'm a little nervous, but doing well. And how about you, Andrea?
Yeah, I'm doing well. What I love about doing this virtually, I mean, I'm such a people person, so I love meeting people, talking to people, being connected in person. But what I'm really loving about this opportunity is that people are able to join us from neighbor islands. We had people last time from the mainland, from as far away as New York.
Wow, that's wonderful.
Yeah, amazing. So I think that aspect of it is really a big plus.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely, I think, helping people to think through how they might reach larger audiences during this time.
Definitely.
So, I mean, you know.
Definitely, which is it's just an amazing opportunity to be able to share things that you would normally share with 30 or 40 people in a room with 100 people from all over, you know.
Absolutely.
So I think I'm sure there'll be more people logging on as we get going, but I think I'll start with the introduction now so that we can keep things timely and make sure you have enough time for your presentation. So I will just get going. So for those still logging on, everything's being taped. So if you miss anything in the beginning, no, not to worry. You'll be able to watch it on YouTube on our Historic Hawaii Foundation YouTube channel. So I just want to welcome everyone. Aloha, my name is Andrea Nando-Scar, and I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawaii Foundation. I really want to thank you for joining us for today's virtual event. It's our second one. It's about the groundbreaking life and work of U.S. Congresswoman Patsy Mink. And as we explore her history, We encourage you to think about whether we can draw lessons for today from the key events and initiatives that help define her legacy based on current world events. Today's presentation is an encore of the one Amy shared at the 33rd Annual Experts at the Cathedral Lunchtime Lecture Series this past February. This series showcased notable women in Hawaiian history in honor of the 2020, sorry about that, in honor of the 2020 centennial commemoration of women's suffrage. Our presenter has enhanced her earlier talk with some additional content. And Historic Hawaii would also, again, like to extend a warm mahalo to the curators of the Experts Lecture Series on Notable Women, which is Dr. Ralph Kam and Jesse Otto of the Historic Preservation Program, Department of American Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Again, a few virtual housekeeping items. Just real quickly, we're recording on Zoom, but we're also recording on YouTube Live, so people can watch it live now as well from there. And we will be posting the video replay by next week, if not sooner. If you have questions for the presenter during the talk and immediately following her talk, please type them in the Q&A box on the Zoom menu bar, which you can find on the bottom of your screen. And we anticipate having at least 10, perhaps 15 minutes at the end of the presentation so that Amy can respond to as many questions as possible. Very briefly, for those who are new to Historic Hawaii Foundation, we are a statewide nonprofit, and we help people save historic places through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. I'd now like to introduce and extend a warm welcome to today's speaker. Amy Mulligan is a PhD student in the Department of History at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her studies concentrate on Hawaii's history and its intersection with the world from the mid-19th century through the early 20th century. Her focus is on the impact of this intersection as it relates to gender, intermarriage, and family, race, immigration, and nation building. Amy is also a mother of two and a professional genealogist. We hope you enjoy her presentation.
Thank you, Andrea. So thank you, everybody. Velina mai kako. Thank you to the Historic Hawaii Foundation for allowing me this opportunity to speak to everybody online today about Patsy Mink. And also thank you to Dr. Kam and Jesse for inviting me to give this talk earlier this year. And thank you to everyone who decided to attend this lecture and to hear my humble thoughts regarding Patsy Mink, her career and her legacy. My name is Amy Mulligan, and as previously mentioned, I'm a graduate student in the Department of History at UH Manoa. So I'll preface my entire discussion by saying that I am not a scholar regarding Patsy Mink, her legislation, or the political system in general. And I'm certainly not an expert on her political career or her personal life. And I didn't work with her. It was really a much more selfish reason that encouraged me to ask if I could speak about Patsy Mink. Being a non-traditional student and a mother in a PhD program and having a very difficult year, I began this year feeling rather adrift, wondering where I might find some strength and resolution and some grit and determination, and sometimes just the wherewithal to make it through the day, to be there for my kids, get my work done, and get dinner on the table. I drew and I continue to draw strength from my daughters, my family, my dear friends, my amazingly supportive colleagues and mentors, and Patsy Mink. In these times, with economic, political, social, and particularly racial inequalities becoming unavoidably apparent among the violent murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, two of the most recent victims of the physical, mental, and spiritual violence that systemic racial inequity has caused in the United States, as well as during this COVID crisis, and how it has shone a light on how certain communities have been historically and continue to be discriminated against. Patsy Mink was one of those who was unafraid to speak up against discriminatory practices and was determined to change them. So I'm ashamed to say that I grew up not knowing who Patsy Mink was or what she had contributed either to nation, state, or community. Excuse me. She passed away when I was starting my sophomore year in college, and I remember there being an outpouring of sentiment for this congressional representative from the state of Hawaii. I didn't recognize, comprehend, or consider what her struggles were, how she had overcome them, or the achievements she'd realized. I hadn't experienced the same ceiling, the same limitations that Patsy Mink and other women had, at least not yet, and not in the same kind of direct way that they had. I think the first time that I read about Patsy Mink was when they renamed the Central Oahu District Park after her in 2007, and I wondered what she had done that would prompt this renaming. This was the same year my elder daughter was born, and I remember learning for the first time about Title IX legislation, what it meant, and why it was important. For those of us less familiar with Title IX, which after her death was renamed the Patsy T. Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act, was originally established as a clause of the 1972 Federal Education Amendments signed into law on 23 June 1972. In part, it states that, quote, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. It applies to a variety of programs, but it has been challenged most intensely because of its impact on student athletics. This is because, according to the Title IX clause, each college and university must have a ratio of male to female athletes that is equal to its ratio of male to female students. But a school is still in compliance with Title IX if it has proven record of expansion in an effort to reach the correct ratios. I was amazed by this law because of the fact that it had to be a law. I began to understand why it had to be a law because of the intense backlash that this law ignited, but I'll get back to this discussion in a little bit. Back to my ignorance. As I continued to learn more about her, little by little, I began to better understand the matrix within which she was operating, one where, as an Asian American and a woman working in fields dominated by men, she was more open to criticism. And I don't mean criticism simply regarding her politics, but her appearance, how she dressed, the coif of her hair. As I learned and thought more about this, I became more attuned to these discussions with women of all ages, but particularly women who are of my mom's generation or older. Some simply describe these limitations as a thing that women had to get through in order to get where they were going. Others were noticeably disgusted with the way that things had been. Women couldn't get a credit card or take out a loan without a man signing, being told to serve tea or coffee when it wasn't part of the job description, and being counseled or funneled perhaps into certain professions despite having no desire to do so. But these were jobs that were acceptable for women to do, like teacher or nurse. And there is nothing wrong with these careers. Both require much hard work and dedication. What is wrong with this is that it encourages the idea that women have certain jobs that they can do outside the house, and men have certain jobs that they can do, which has no basis in anything but societal and cultural norms and mores. I remember my 7th grade teacher telling us she went into teaching mathematics because there were no women engineers at the university she attended and felt forced out despite her high aptitude in math. Patsy Mink knew something about this. Born in 1927 in Paia on Maui's North Shore, to Suematsu Takemoto, a civil engineer, and Mitana Tateyama Takemoto. Very early on, she was involved in representation. She was the president of her graduating class of 1944 from Maui High, as well as their valedictorian. She attended Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. One reason that is cited for her taking leave from the University of Nebraska is the racial discrimination she endured there. When she first transferred to the University of Nebraska, she was assigned to live in the, quote, international house dormitory. This dormitory wasn't just for students that were from other nations, which it did house. International house served as a sort of code for a residential hall of non-whites. She was so incensed at this segregation, she wrote a letter to the editor protesting this policy. Perhaps as a result of her determination to end such practices, the International House was shut down the following semester, and the segregation of residential halls ended. Because of a medical condition that required surgery, she ultimately returned to the University of Hawaii at Manoa and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Zoology and Chemistry in 1948. Patsy Takemoto wanted to be a doctor, but like Daniel Inouye and Frida Kahlo and many others who had aspired to also be doctors, she was forced to make a change in her career path. She was rejected from several medical schools she believed based on her gender and ancestry. Thinking about this makes my head spin, As she understood it, she was rejected because she was a woman of Japanese descent. So I want to take a minute here to process this. Imagine receiving and then reading a letter like that, and rejection is never something that is easy to take. I've endured those letters, and I'm sure many of you have endured them as well. But when you perceive your rejection to be based upon something you have no control over, your ancestry, your color, your gender, your class, just to name a few, what do you do with that? And I don't think she was wrong in her assumption. Women, and particularly Asian American women, had no place in the field of medicine, at least according to the men in power. This brings to mind a history of Japanese midwives that came to live in Hawaii and on the continent that I read. They could not be medical doctors, so they trained as midwives in Japan, just a few decades prior. How do you work to overcome a barrier placed by dominant groups that has been essentialized to biology or extended to something out of your control, like how much money you have? How do you challenge an entire historically rooted power structure? It seems monumental. How do you change an entire narrative? And I suppose one choice is always to give up. Alternatively, you could define another path for yourself. What is it about being a doctor that made her want to be one? My conclusion is that she wanted to help people live a better life. Mrs. Mink's answer was not choice number one. She chose instead of giving up, to pursue a law degree at the University of Chicago in 1948. It's there that she met her husband, John Mink, who was a geology graduate student at the time. They married in January of 1951, and she graduated later that year. With her degree in hand, she applied to a variety of different jobs in Chicago, but nobody would hire her because 1, she was a woman, 2, she was a married woman, and 3, she was Asian American. After she gave birth to their daughter, she had a fourth challenge to overcome, set in place by societal expectations of women. She was now a mother. She found employment at the University of Chicago Library while still applying to positions as a lawyer. Since there were no offers of employment and prospects were looking slim, they returned to Hawaii the following year in 1952. She took the bar exam in Hawaii and passed, the first Japanese American woman to do so, and still could find no employment. It wasn't because she was Asian American this time, as Hawaii already had established Asian American lawyers who were men. Some of them were Japanese American and had benefited from the Veterans Affairs benefits after bravely serving their country in the 442nd RCT. Her exclusion was based upon her gender and her status as a married mother. In response to this exclusion, she started her own firm. For payment, her first client offered her a fish, and Patsy Mink took it. 4 years after she opened her first practice, she ran for and won a seat in the Hawaii Territorial House. Mrs. Mink said that, quote, "I didn't start off wanting to be in politics. Not being able to get a job from anybody changed things. To get her name out there, she knocked on doors, walked neighborhood streets, and spoke with constituents, which was an uncommon tactic at the time. Between her return to Hawaii and running for the Territorial House, she had become involved in Hawaii's Democratic Party by founding Oahu Young Democrats. The Democratic Party had, after the end of World War II, gained steam after the return of veterans, particularly the 442nd veterans. She saw them as having the potential to effect the change that she was passionate about. 2 years later, she won a seat in Hawaii's Territorial Senate and was named as chairperson of the Education Committee. In 1959, after statehood dissolved the territorial legislature, she ran for Hawaii's seat in the US House of Representatives, but lost to Daniel Inouye. There was certainly internal politics within Hawaii's Democratic Party that affected this. Mink never had a close relationship with state Democratic Party leadership, at least partly due to their lack of support for her and because her own agenda was not always a part of theirs. Despite losing her bid for the US House seat, she continued her work in the Democratic Party until 1962, when she was elected into the Hawaii State Senate. It was at this point that, though education remained an important focus, she extended that focus to women's rights and pay equality. The year 1964 was the one that brought Patsy Mink to the US Congress, and she remained there until 1976. A second position had been created in the House of Representatives, and through the support of her volunteers and her husband, she won the seat. She was the first Asian American woman in Congress and one of only 12 women out of hundreds of congressmen. These 12 women were excluded from House facilities, like the gym. Upon her arrival, her exoticness and diminutive stature was commented upon. In 1964, when my parents were in middle school, and because she was accused of neglecting her child because she was working, because fathers in childcare apparently were disconnected. When asked about how she balanced being a married mother and a congresswoman, she calmly replied, quote, "I think that's the most offensive question that's ever been asked. I've never heard anyone ask a man, how has it been on your family? These sorts of comments have hardly stopped." When Hillary Clinton ran for president in the last presidential election, she was asked how being a grandmother might affect her presidency. Harmful gendered comments are still aimed at women, particularly women of color, who are elected into Congress. The most recent and explosive commentary has been to and from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's not afraid to fire back. Her responses made me think of Patsy Mink, who would respond without fear as to the plain inequality these questions about balance presume. This is the time in which legislation she was passionate about was created and passed. She, working alongside other members of Congress who were committed to closing the gender gap and providing equal access to education, services, and jobs, passed landmark legislation of Title IX in 1972 and the Women's Educational Equality Act in 1974. Patsy Mink fought tirelessly for issues pertaining to gender equality, affordable childcare, bilingual education, and poverty. Patsy Mink also passed the first childcare bill, as well as the legislation that created bilingual education, student loans, special education, professional sabbaticals for teachers, and the Head Start program. She also authored the vetoed Comprehensive Child Development Act that was incorporated into the Economic Opportunity Act in 1971, but failed to become law because it encouraged women to work outside the home and communal childcare systems. Though it made it through the House, Richard Nixon eventually vetoed the bill. And she really had a bone to pick with Richard Nixon, not just because of his vetoing the bill, but because at least partially of the Vietnam War. She opposed the war effort starting in 1967, though she did support the veterans when she voted against raising taxes to support the conflict efforts. She was also against nuclear testing on Amchita Island in the Aleutian Chain, filing suit against the Environmental Protection Agency based on the Freedom of Information Act. Though her case was ruled in favor of the defendant based on the importance of these documents about the nuclear testing and foreign policy, her case was ultimately brought to the US Supreme Court, which upheld the initial decision. However, it did allow Congress to legislate new disclosure guidelines. Congress eventually amended the FOIA, and though President Gerald Ford vetoed the bill, Congress overrode this veto, allowing the proverbial floodgates to be opened for previously withheld documents. In this same period, in 1970, Patsy Mink went before the Senate as a witness to testify against the Supreme Court nominee George Harold Carswell. She began, quote, "I'm here to testify against his confirmation on the grounds that his appointment constitutes an affront to the women of America," end quote. Her testimony was the first of a swelling of support against Carswell. Nixon's third choice for the seat, Harry Blackmun, a Republican from the Midwest. The importance of this is critical in hindsight. Blackmun wrote the majority opinion for the Roe versus Wade case that was decided in 1973, affirming the rights of choice for a pregnant woman. These issues, still important today, have been emerging recently and vehemently. One recent example is in the hearings regarding the appointment of Brett Kavanaugh as a Supreme Court justice. In the presidential election of 1972, Mink was invited to run on the Oregon ballot. In an article published on 20 May 1972, just a month after her controversial visit to Paris to speak with a delegate from North Vietnam, Tom Kaufman wrote of an interview he had recently had with her. It first reflected upon the loss felt upon the murder of Robert Kennedy 4 years prior, and how she felt, quote, "cast adrift," end quote, by this loss, not just a personal one, but a national one. In this article, she set forth her bill of particulars against Richard Nixon. It read, 1, let us not be afraid to tell the American people that President Nixon lied in 1968 when he said he had a peace plan to end this miserable war. And here a point that Caucasian candidates have not made effectively, that the Vietnam War has strong racial overtones. Is the president saying that Asian deaths don't count? Is this our morality? Nixon's brazen abuses of our standard ethics, as she describes the ITT affair and others. So she was wondering, where is the justice for Blacks, for Chicanos, for women, for the poor, the quote unquote justice that does not have to wait, is that dispensed to big business? The third was Nixon's appealing to the worst in human nature and his utterances against busing. So quote, President Nixon must be removed from office because he's a chameleon, or worse yet, a hypocrite, end quote. She was also against the fourth point, which she was against, was government secrecy. And the fifth was the economy, and particularly widespread unemployment, Nixon's, quote, acceptable rate of misery in America, end quote. So the article continues on to say, quote, in this Honolulu restaurant, Mrs. Mink takes the side of the young people of Hawaii who are trying to undo the Burns Organization, end quote. I thought this was particularly interesting since Mrs. Mink also taught a variety of courses at the University of Hawaii in the interstices of her political appointments and offices. She believed that the students, the next generations, were a potentially powerful engine of change. And so here I'd like to talk a little bit more about Title IX. As I mentioned before, it was intended to remove discrimination in any, quote, education program or activity, end quote, that received federal funding. It was created, at least in part, to address what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not. And then President Lyndon Johnson was working to fill these gaps. It was initially created to address hiring and unemployment in institutions receiving federal funding. Most people, if asked about Title IX, would respond about it regarding its impact on women's collegiate sports. Before Title IX, there was no Wahine Rainbow volleyball, basketball, softball, and other sports that are much loved today. Title IX gave these women's sports the resources they needed. It allowed many scholar athletes the ability to go to school on scholarship. Indeed, there was much pushback and continues to be some pushback about Title IX as it relates to sports. People would angrily comment about how Title IX takes money away from sports that bring in funding, like men's collegiate football, for sports that do not bring in funding, generally women's sports. Some of these detractors might say that, well, having equality in other areas is okay, but in sports, if women want to do sports, it shouldn't take funding away from men's sports that bring in the funding. Indeed, Title IX has continued to be in the news for not only sports, but for its facets that prevent sexual harassment and assault. In a 2017 Honolulu Star Advertiser article, the year that Title IX turned 45, Amy Monk and Jean Evans explored the far-reaching, mostly positive benefits that have extended beyond its benefits for sports. Broadly, they noted that, quote, Title IX addresses gender biases and gives teachers the tools to fight these biases in their lessons. It protects pregnant students and students with children, giving equal access to education to these students. It strives to provide a safe learning environment free of sexual bias, harassment, or assault, end quote. More recently, Title IX has been deployed to stop sexual harassment and assault in schools and universities receiving federal funding. Nationwide, Title IX policies have been adopted with counselors to assist in its administration and requires that schools have procedures in place to address the issue and that it takes steps to, quote, eliminate the hostile environment, ensure for the care of the survivor, end quote. The Women's Educational Equality Act of 1974 was also authored by Patsy Mink in order to provide the resources through which institutions could put Title IX into effect. As another example of how the US is still grappling with gender equality, the Gender Equity Education Act of 2019 was proposed in order to provide further support for the implementation of Title IX. In other words, gender equality is still elusive. In 1975, Patsy Mink and others, including Representative Martha Griffins from Michigan, encouraged the adoption and ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, which, had it been adopted, would be the 27th Amendment to our Constitution. Though this amendment has yet to be adopted, it opened further a discussion of what gender equality means, at least through Patsy Mink and her colleagues' eyes. The United Nations designated 1975 as International Women's Year. And so they designated it as an International Women's Year so that nations could focus their attention on ways that they could advance the status of women around the world. So as they were talking about what it meant, what women's equality or what equality meant, and what the liberation movement meant, according to Griffiths, it was to be better, that women were better educated, and many were forced by economic necessity to work. But when they went to work, they found tremendous discrimination against them. And then they also discovered, so it was kind of a double sense of discrimination because it wasn't just them re-entering the workplace, but they're also hearing about what people thought of homemakers. And Social Security, and Mink provided an example that Social Security discriminates against women with laws, and women until recently had reached retirement age after working a full lifetime were only beginning to realize that there was inequity in the law, and have brought these matters to attention of the people back home. So one example of this was a woman's husband couldn't draw on her Social Security, and if she passed away, her children couldn't draw. So even if they'd worked for 35 years and went to withdraw her Social Security. And she was asked if she'd had a husband, and she said yes. She could still draw, even if he had died many years before, could draw on his Social Security. And so what their point was that they weren't trying to just have women be dominant, over men. It was that they're trying to bring attention to the need for equality for both men and women to access federal benefits. So that in the Equal Rights Amendment, they were thinking that it was a way for a woman, another reason they needed it was that they mentioned the ways that a woman could be supported by the government is to get rid of her husband and take the kids down and get welfare. But should a man need to get welfare, he was not necessarily eligible for that. So they spent a considerable amount of energy bringing attention to the fact that there were these discrepancies and loopholes in federal law. So the ERA was actually never ratified, as it did not achieve adoption by the requisite 38 states. And in this particular interview, which I've been kind of summarizing, Patsy Mink also said, quote, "So long as any part of our society adheres to a sexist notion that men should do certain things and women should do certain things, and then begin to inculcate our babies with these certain notions through curriculum development and so forth, that we'll never be rid of the basic causes of sex discrimination," end quote. In 1976, Mink ran for a Senate seat and lost, ending her 12 years in Washington. She briefly served in the Carter administration as Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environmental Affairs until 1978, after which she returned to her law practice in Hawaii. In 1983, she was elected into the Honolulu City Council and served there until 1987, but lost in the next two elections, one bid for governor in 1986 and a bid for mayor in 1988. She returned to Congress in 1990 after a special election to fill the vacant seat of the just passed Daniel Akaka. She found a very different environment than when she previously served in the time of Great Society legislation, finding that now she had to act to defend the equality legislation she'd introduced 20 years prior. And though Patsy Mink was intensely focused on equality on a national level, she never lost sight of the importance of Hawaii and the Asia Pacific region. In particular, I was interested in her preservation efforts as well as her anti-nuclear testing efforts. During her time in Congress, she flew back every week in order to maintain connection with the people of Hawaii, though she was often criticized for being out of touch. She encouraged the ending of the bombing of Kaho'olawe. According to one letter of the editor, the author chided her efforts because it was based on the claim that the pilots would miss. Sam Amalu, who was noted as, quote, Hawaii's con man and newspaper columnist, end quote, in a 2013 article in the Garden Isle about his life. So he wrote an article published on 19 January 1972, of which there's an excerpt on the screen, which he titled "The Outrageous Patsy Mink." So as an aside, he was noted for his support of Native Hawaiian issues, and this article demonstrates that quite well. He begins the article by noting the unlikely possibility that what he says will affect any national policy. And he says, quote, "When I say things off the top of my head, not too many people pay too much attention to it," end quote. He continues on, which I will quote at length. Quote, "On the other hand, Patsy Mink is a congresswoman and an avowed candidate for the American presidency. When she says something off the top of her head, as she very often does, quite a number of people listen to it. And a few surprisingly foolish ones even believe it. Some while ago, Patsy Mink was complaining about the low altitude bombing missions that the Army and the Marines were conducting as part of the training at the Pohakuloa training area on Hawaii. She was afraid that the bombers might miss their target and hit the city of Hilo instead. I think she forgot the 13,000-foot land masses of Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa that offer reasonable protection to the Hilo and volcano areas from a possible mishap that could occur at Pohakuloa. And Hilo must be some 60 or 70 miles from Pohakuloa. Surely we can expect a fair measure of accuracy from our bombardiers, at least to the extent that they would not miss their target by that distance. Unless, of course, it was the intention of the military to bomb Hilo deliberately, as the Navy once bombed the front yard of Mayor Carvalho on the island of Maui. And then Patsy got all wrought up over the fish pond at Kaloko, had a whole lot of congressmen down there to convince them that Kaloko should become a national park, or at least a historical site. Then the inference was made that the remains of King Kamehameha were secreted there, and that Kaloko was a royal fish pond. That is, of course, ridiculous. Every single fish pond in the islands was royal. Who else could afford to maintain one? And the site of Kamehameha's interment is not all that secret. The king's body was hidden by the High Chief Ho'olulu, the son of Chief Kame'eamoku and Kahikoloa. He has many descendants living today. Among these are the Beckleys, the Pittmans, and my own family. Many of us know exactly where the king is interred. Some of us have even gone there to clean up the place, some of us more than once, end quote. He concludes his article with a strident rebuke about her comparison of what America was doing in South Vietnam with what the Germans did to the Jews in the 1930s and 1940s. Though I'm not avowing agreement or disagreement with any of her statements, what I have to say is this. If we think of what she said in the 1974 interview with Wendy Ross, that I briefly discussed earlier, that she had to, in a way, translate her intention for a different audience. It sounds off the cuff to the ear. Perhaps Patsy Mink had thought about ways to end militarization practices on Hawaiian land in a way that people both here and on the continental US might understand. As I've come to learn, sometimes the ways in which funding for opportunities are made available are under institutions that might give one pause. But we often find ourselves asking the question, does the end justify the means? Who is or can be hurt or violated? What are the repercussions? These are questions that one has to answer for themselves and come to terms with what the outcomes might be. And Patsy Mink lived her life knowing that she did what she thought was right. She lent her voice to those who she felt needed it. Even if her attempts were put down, she spoke for those who could not speak for themselves, bringing attention to issues that affected a variety of people that generally have very little political power, particularly on a national scale. She left this world on 28 September 2002 as a result of a respiratory infection due to chickenpox. There was an outpouring of regret and sorrow that she had left the world too soon. Many commented on her tireless efforts, her grit, her willingness to help those that needed it, that she had been part of the tide of change for the better on a local and national scale. In 2008, a life-size statue was erected in her honor on Punchbowl Street across from City Hall and outside the Hawaii State Library. I walked by it with my daughters a few months ago as we entered the library before COVID. I'm sure many of you have seen the statue. Her hand is outstretched, a gesture offering help and assistance. Some of her quotes surround the statue, which include, "While we must end the Vietnam War, it is even more important to look beyond this dark era, to examine our own nature and the racism that lies underneath." It was, the second quote, "It was a case of my living up to my own views and conscience. If I was defeated for it, that's the way it had to be. There was no way in which I could compromise." The third quote is, "I rise to speak for the millions of women and children who will be affected by what we do in Congress." And the fourth quote, "America is about having the greatness to offer help where needed." So those were just a few. There's several others. And these are undoubtedly words of wisdom, hard won. When we saw the statue, my daughters, 10 and 12, asked me about Patsy Mink. And before they could run away, I told them that she struggled hard every day for us to be able to do what we want to do, so we can choose our own path. Okay, so I'm sure I didn't say that exactly to my kids. I said something probably more grumpy, but anyway, they looked at me strangely and went running on into the library. But I'm glad that as for now, they don't know what a glass ceiling is. They don't know what challenges that Patsy Mink and countless others have had to face. They are dreaming of being an architect, of being a photographer, of being a lawyer who can make a difference in people's lives. And I too have benefited from the work that she did. I received a degree in biology and planned on becoming a doctor. And the reason that I didn't become a doctor wasn't because I was rejected from 12 medical schools like she was based upon her gender and race. I realized I didn't want to interact with other people's bodily fluids. And after working for a decade, I could go back to school as a mother and wife without having to worry about whether I'd be rejected because of my status as either, or as a woman, or as someone of Native Hawaiian, Japanese, and Portuguese ancestry at 32 years old. So change is not something that takes place overnight, generally speaking. It takes time, effort, and work. I asked earlier how such a monumental change in historically embedded systems of difference, such as gender, class, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, to name a few, could happen. And the answer is one step at a time, and never in isolation. Patsy Mink, though credited for being outspoken, had networks of people which supported her, encouraged her, helped her to write and pass these bills. These networks were people of different backgrounds. She was criticized, and she was not perfect. Who is? But she did what she could to help people who needed it. Patsy Mink's lifetime of efforts led me to reflect on the nature of struggle. As I checked in with a dear mentor of mine several months ago, commenting about my own struggles, she made a comment that seemed curious and perhaps a bit scary when it first struck my ears, but as it sank in, it was rather comforting. She told me that struggle doesn't end. It might be a continuing struggle or a different struggle, but that doesn't take away from the emotions and the end product of struggle. Struggle is pain, and sometimes it's rupture, and sometimes it's violence. But it can also be about joy, happiness, and success. I'd been feeling overwhelmed and rather like I was drowning, and so her points about struggle made me feel buoyed. Somehow, I realized that I'm here to also bring about change for good, giving people help and giving people a voice. It's something that we can all do, and the struggle can be as beautiful as it is difficult and painful. And no, I'm not going to be a politician. Public speaking makes me very anxious. But I am a historian, or rather, I'm learning how to be a historian. And as I've been reflecting upon today, the present is inextricably informed by the past. How we understand our own world is based on history at a variety of levels: personal, family, community, place, gender, race, class, and other systems of differentiation, and how we categorize the world still play an immense role in our lives and still works to empower and restrain us at different times and sometimes at the same time. So I'd like to conclude by quoting a portion of Patsy Mink's speech to the Kaimuki High School graduating class of 1968, which she entered into the congressional record on 1 August 1968. She refers explicitly here in the speech to the assassination of Robert Kennedy, but also, I believe, to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., who she mentions earlier in the speech. These words resonate today as loudly as it must have then, and I encourage everyone listening to consider how you can be a part of change for good, how you can contribute, no matter how large or small, to giving a voice to someone, a community, a movement, or otherwise make room for those who have been sidelined, marginalized, ignored, forgotten, or forcibly silenced. I quote, "I believe that there is still hope in our country, that we do not need to be content with mediocrity, that we do have the right to hitch our stars to the heavens and strive for excellence, that we do have the innate goodness to recognize evil and demagoguery and to see that right shall overcome all obstacles and succeed. I believe all this because you are and you must be that hope if this nation is to resemble your future, what it set out to be 200 years ago. Your work and mine is doubtless more difficult today than it was yesterday. For in the yesterday, we could so easily forfeit our roles as citizens in a democracy by simply saying to ourselves that our leaders could guide us over the rough and troubled waters and gain for us the progress that each new generation demands. Today, we know of the frailty of our bodies, that one simple bullet could end its throbbing vitality forever. We cannot, therefore, believe in only one man and expect that he alone has the burden to correct all the wrongs perpetuated upon our fellow citizens. For if we did that, his death would bring to an end the direction which was his claim to greatness. It isn't easy to understand what is happening to America or to try to appreciate the importance of these events which have stirred this nation. But I want you to know that from where I stand, there is nothing more important to you and I as Americans than the course that we shall take to preserve our freedoms, to make this society more just, and to save future generations from the ravages of war and internal strife." So she goes on to conclude with, to whatever degree each of you here today acknowledge a sense of individual responsibility for the common good and for the welfare of others less fortunate than you, I urge you not to lose it, to cherish it, and to make that sense of purpose your higher goal for life, so as to give it great dimension of meaning, end quote. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Amy. That was it's so relevant to what's happening right now. It's incredible. And I just want to make sure your audio is working okay. Can you just say a few words? It was doing really well, and then at the very end, it was just getting a little sketchy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it still sketchy?
I went just a little. I mean, people can let us know if they can't hear. I mean, I can still hear it. It was just a little bit uneven. Wow, that's a lot to digest. We have several questions that are coming up right now. And One of them was, in addition to the statue that you mentioned and the quotes that you shared there, are there any other sites associated with her life and legacy that you're aware of? Obviously, there's Old Maui High School where she attended. Are there any other sites that you're aware of related to her life or her legacy here in the islands?
I mean, the park, the Waipi'o, the Central Park was renamed in her honor, but it's not in the same kind of, it's not celebrating her legacy in the same way that perhaps the statue does. And Andrea, you shared with me that wonderful, I think it was the National Parks site.
Right.
And I think that there was a good job of kind of following her life and giving little bits about it. So, but I'm not aware of any other monument similar to that one. I think that one was probably the most well-known and, out there, publicly available.
Thank you. I will share that article, which mentions a few places after with the information that we send out when we send out the video recording link. I haven't had a chance to go through the whole thing, so definitely we'll share that with everyone. Someone else asked what's the current status of Title IX? Does the recent Supreme Court ruling expand it? Are there any current threats to it?
Is having sketchy internet.
Yeah, it's a little, your internet is.
Yeah, I don't know. It tends to do this in the afternoon and I don't know why. So hopefully, is it a little better now? I'm kind of.
Yeah, I think we just keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's just been the same threats. There's always been kind of an ongoing, consistent threat to funding. Like there's the actual Title IX, but then there's other legislation that's necessary to provide funding to implement it. So I think that's been something that has been consistently under threat of being removed, despite it being a federal, guideline that people have to comply with. So I think that institutions are still struggling with that, and in Congress they're still kind of having to ask for money and make sure that it gets funded so that we can continue to pursue, equality and federally funded educational institutions.
And that brings me to the idea that, and it's similar with preservation, is that while you can change things, you always have to be diligent because there seems to be always the forces that want to take away whatever victories you have. And so actually my question is, in your research, and did you come across who were the people who inspired Patsy? Like, how did she maintain this continual kind of barrage of coming up against these institutions and these mores and these cultural structures that were not receptive to, equality and justice that she'd like to see, yet she kept going. Like everywhere she went, she was trying to knock down the walls. And what was that like for her? So happen to know like who inspired her or who her?
I can only make conjecture as to who that might be, but these are just my conjectures, but her family certainly for supporting her through this, like her husband and her daughter and other family members, her friends, places where she could feel safe to express herself, because as we all know, even in, we don't necessarily have the same professional face as we might have in our private life, a space that we can kind of express our concerns that we might not be able to do out in public. So I'm sure that she had a very close network of people to support her through those trying times. But I also believe that there were her fellow congressional members, some of them men, some of them women, that supported her causes and were as passionate about them as she was. I believe that she had those allies in her political life also. So I think, I'm not sure who else might have provided that kind of inspiration, but I believe that the people around her kind of also kept her going, besides her own, of course, incredible fortitude to keep going through all of the challenges.
And that she certainly had. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible the mountains that she had to climb, but she didn't back
Absolutely.
down. Someone was asking, how well known is she on the mainland? And another part is like, is she taught here in the schools? I know someone mentioned a comment about the History Day projects include her, but how about in the curriculum here in school? And then is she also known on the mainland? Did you come upon that in your research? Or how
Oh,
well known is she for all the groundbreaking legislation and changes that she
great
made?
question. So as I mentioned, I have daughters that are, they're 10 and 12 now. And
Mhm.
I go through the books that talk about inspirational women and, inspirational people in America. And I'm not sure which book it was, or which books, but I have seen her in those books mentioned and the things that she worked for. Um, I'm trying to think so I'm not aware that she's really well known. I mean, and I have to say for myself that I didn't learn about her necessarily growing up in school or otherwise. My daughters have only heard of her because I've been talking about her. But they're in fourth. They just ended fourth and sixth grade, so they haven't quite, I think, gotten there in their curriculum. But I do recall seeing some things in History Day, so that's wonderful. I mean, and not just Patsy Mink, but other women that have contributed to, equality of all kinds, I think need to be out there more, because if we don't know what they did and the context within which they had to do it, it's easy to take whatever gains that they've created for granted.
Absolutely. I'm just looking at the questions. Um, I'm just wondering, like, how was she perceived? Um, because she was obviously, as you were mentioning in your talk, people were not receptive to her. I mean, with all of the derogatory comments that, how are you going to take care of your family? And all the things that you said are still kind of here with us to some
Mm-hmm.
extent. But back in her day, they were certainly like, this was trailblazing for a woman to be doing what she was doing. Was she branded by people? Like, she had a group of only 11 other congressional female counterparts at the time. How was she perceived? Are there mention of her being, here she comes again, and just people really didn't want to hear? Or did she have allies, do you think, with, other members of Congress, I would imagine, in order to pass legislation, or male counterparts?
Right. I think there was a mixture of both. I mean, just from reading through the newspapers has been really interesting, and reading through different kinds of congressional records and things like that, and other things written about her, articles, that there was a mixed bag. I mean, not just nationally, but in Hawaii also, where people might say things like, I briefly mentioned that people would comment, well, don't vote for her because she's not here in Hawaii, and why would you want to vote for her? And there were people certainly when she first got elected that thought, wow, this is very exotic. There's this Asian woman that's here now. And look how pretty she is. And yeah, so I mean, there's still that which exists. But I think that there were definitely people that were very much there for her and very supportive of her in her many different endeavors. Because even when she wasn't in office, she was teaching, or she was part of she had different, organizations that she worked with. And so I think, I mean, there was a lot of grassroots support for her also, that may not have been as popular, but were consistent. So, but yeah, there were definitely comments that were kind of derogatory because regarding her capability or how out there she might be. So there was a bunch of different kinds of uh, uh, reactions and reactions to her.
I just want to share, Ingrid Peterson shared that a comment that she graduated high school here in 1973 and Patsy Mink was my hero, someone who believed in all the causes I believed in. She was inspirational. And then Ingrid also asked, did she support McGovern for president in 1972, even in the primary?
Oh, that I'm not sure about. I mean, I think you could probably skim through the paper. I mean, I could skim through the papers and find out. I mean, they were pretty, you know, when they put out elections and they'll say, well, you know, I'm for this person or I'm for that person. Yeah, but I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Would you say her greatest legislative success was Title IX or something else?
I would say that that's her most well-known legacy. But I also think that her efforts that weren't necessarily successful in the way that they were passed, you know, like the Equal Rights Amendment wasn't passed, but it was definitely something that brought attention to the need for equality, and not just like, you know, like in the interview I was quoting, it wasn't just for women to have access to things, but for men to have access to things, which I think was something that had to be brought out more, because people just saw it as this one way, well, you know, women need more things and support. Well, no, men couldn't have the same access in some instances to, you know, resources to help them if they didn't have a spouse, or, you know, because there were also assumptions about men that were damaging to many families, I'm sure. But so I think that Title IX was definitely her best known. But I feel like, you know, we should understand where perhaps what she advocated for wasn't passed, why it wasn't passed, and is there something that is it still valuable to us today to consider revisiting, you know, all these years later?
That's what I was going to ask too. You know, in light of all the things that are happening and the need for equality and justice, what can we learn from her struggle and her persistence and perseverance, I think, as a role model to keep trying and keep, you know, having the conversations, bringing things into the forefront so that people can become aware of them and start to think about things differently. Absolutely. Which leads to changes. Somebody asked, how did she become supportive of veteran affairs? I think after this one, maybe we'll take one more question. How did she become supportive of veteran affairs? I remember her being with Arohana when we celebrated at the annual Veterans Makawao Cemetery.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing. You know, these individual stories. I love it. I love oral histories too. So I appreciate
I will share all of these with you. Yeah, I will share everyone. Just to let you know, I'll share all these comments afterwards with Amy.
I'm not certain how she got involved with different organizations, but I know that she did support veterans. So like, for example, in the Vietnam War, it wasn't the soldiers that were going that she protested. It was, you know, the government, like, you know, just kind of the war on a bigger scale, bigger political scale than these men that were drafted in. So, and you know, coming from her generation, I you know, it makes sense that she would have supported like the 442nd and the efforts that because they too had to face a lot of discrimination, which, you know, like there were racially segregated units of not just Japanese Americans, but others also. So they faced an incredible struggle that I imagine she must have supported. So, I mean, I'm not too certain of those specific origins, but I am aware that generally she did, you know, she was involved in, you know, I can imagine that she would have wanted to support families whose members fought in wars, who, you know, some of them didn't come home. So, yeah, I can imagine.
Sure.
It made sense to her.
Thanks. And finally, maybe just based on the research you did, and you kind of got under her skin and became, you know, I felt like when you were sharing that you really learned a lot about her and the way she moved about in the world. And do you think she'd have any words for us today, or would the words that she shared still be relevant today as they were?
Yeah, I think
as you
so.
read them?
As I was reading it, it was like, you know,
Right.
it was hard to believe that this was, I mean, not hard to believe, but it was just so timely, is what I mean. That to come across this and to be asked to present about Patsy Mink, I mean, it's just a hard reminder that though we have come far, I don't think we've come far enough, and that there's still a lot of work to be done. And I don't think, I mean, she didn't stop working until she became ill. So, you know, and I think that, yeah, I think she entered them into the congressional record so that it wouldn't be forgotten, you know, and hopefully, I think she was hoping it would be something that we could look back on and say, well, that was a terrible time, but we haven't gotten to that point yet. So I feel that it's just words that continue to guide us.
I feel the same. Just to let everyone know, when we had asked Amy to do this was before George Floyd's death, and kind of everything erupted. So it was just amazing timing to be able to have this conversation and learn more about Patsy and her legacy, which is still so relevant right now. So Amy, thank you so much. I really
thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. I hope everyone's enjoyed. I just want to say goodbye. If there's other questions, I will send them that we didn't get to. I'll send them on to Amy, and the ones that we can answer, we will share that. We'll post it on the website. And thank you. Just thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope that you did enjoy the presentation. I want to thank my colleague, Michelle Kisek, who's been providing technical support. And I also want to announce that we will have our next virtual presentation on July 9th. So if you are not yet signed up for our e-newsletter, I encourage you to go to historichawaii.org and sign up for that. It will be on Kuhina Nui Kekaluohi, Hawaiian Women, Power and Law in the Mid-19th Century. And also, if you would are interested to support HHF and our work, there are many ways to do that. You can also find that on our website under the Join Us section. We hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening, and we hope that you and your loved ones stay healthy and inspired during what is really turbulent times. And so please take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we hope everyone has a great night. And thank you again for joining us. Aloha. Bye, everyone.